Is war justified when the cause is worthwhile? In other words, is there such a thing as a good war? If any war was, it would have been World War II, the time when fascist regimes of Europe loomed over the world waiting for the takeover. However, before such a question could be answered, it is important to know how the war started. In 1929, the stock market crashed, with banks around the world loaning to each other and being intertwined. When the stock market crashed, everything was sucked into the turmoil. The crash originated in America and was caused by a vicious cycle of overproduction, a reduced demand, and very low pay for workers. The Great Depression had many effects on the world. The most obvious was people lost their jobs and they could not get paid enough. The lack of jobs increased homelessness. This led to the formation of shanty towns across America, known as Hoovervilles, named after Herbert Hoover, the president that many Americans blame for the Great Depression. In addition, the suicide rate and admission to mental wards shot up as people could not cope with the loss of so much so fast. The Dust Bowl also contributed to the devastation of the Great Depression. In the Great Plains, the drought consumed the land, drying up all the soil. Huge windstorms would pick up the dust and carry it as far as miles into the Atlantic. Needless to say, this was hard on farmers of the area. During this helpless time for America, there was at least a knight in shining armor, FDR and his New Deal. The New Deal would provide regulation of stocks and things, and would also attempt to provide new jobs. The New Deal created many government programs as well, following up three categories. Relief programs would instantly aid those who have been hurt, recovery programs would help to pull the nation out of the depression, and finally reform programs would attempt to make so the depression could not happen again. Consequently, from the depression in the 1930s was a time of change in America. America adopted an isolationist policy and also began to accept a lower quality of living. People were attempting to struggle by on low wages and little food. Another cause of World War II was the end of World War I and the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles quite literally robbed Germany. The inflation rate rose 1,000% one year. Much of Germany's money was taken to cover the damage to Europe from the war, not to mention Germany was stripped of its military. Another greatly contributing factor to World War II was the rise of dictators around the world. The first of these dictators was Benito Mussolini, who ruled fascist Italy. Another dictator was Adolf Hitler, who ruled Germany. Yet another dictator was Francisco Franco, who ruled Spain. He became friends with Hitler and even let Hitler's Luftwaffe carpet bomb his own cities for practice. Ultimately, this would not have been a problem had the free world stepped in, but as they say, all evil needs to succeed is for good men to do nothing. This brings up the question, when should a nation go to war? Generally, a person of the nation would say when the nation is threatened. However, there was an even more dire circumstance which faced the free world. It was not a single nation that was threatened, it was humanity. However, France and Britain appeased Germany by ceding key areas of land. Meanwhile, the United States was locked into an isolationist policy. Eventually, America and Britain signed the North Atlantic Charter, which would allow free trade among all nations if the Allies won. The other response from America was the Lend-Lease Act, which allowed allies to borrow various things from the U.S. and return them after the war if they were still intact. There were several causes for the United States to join the war. However, the last straw was Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, a squad of Japanese fighter planes attacked the naval base of Pearl Harbor, sinking many ships. At this point, the U.S. mobilized for war against the Axis powers. In Europe, the British were constantly being bombed, and Europe was a fortress. The Russians had fiercely fought in the east for months at the city of Stalingrad. Hitler had betrayed the non-aggression pact between the Soviets and the Nazis and was attacking. Over 1 million Russians died, but in the end it was an Allied victory in February 1943. Meanwhile, the British and Americans had taken North Africa and were pushing through Italy. However, that plan failed. Thus, on June 6, 1944, the Allies stormed the beaches of Normandy, successfully punched a hole into Europe. Victory in Europe was declared on May 8, 1945, when the Germans surrendered. The war was also taking place in the Pacific Ocean. General MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz were hopping from island to island on their way to Japan. The Allies were not winning the war until the Battle of Midway in 1943, when much of the Japanese fleet was destroyed. Japan was almost ready to surrender in 1945. This is when the nuclear weapons were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The effects were even more devastating than anyone could ever have imagined. On August 14, 1945, Japan announced its surrender, and the Allies allowed them to keep their emperor as an apology for the bombs. The war changed America greatly. They became a very activist nation worldwide. Mass production had even lifted up the economy, taking it out of the depression, and food rationing was still in effect. Many jobs opened up for all workers, as many workers had been off fighting. Minorities had some special benefits, such as the Navajo being assigned to be code talkers. However, at the same time, the Japanese went through the worst America has ever done. They were sent to internment camps. There were many consequences of World War II. The Jewish race family was given a much controversial nation, Israel, for what they had to go through. Europe was devastated for the most part, and the United Nations was formed as a more effective replacement for the League of Nations. The most long-lasting consequence was that the Cold War between the Soviets and the free world had begun. By far the worst consequence was the 6 million innocents killed in the Holocaust. Is there such a thing as absolute human evil? Such genocide to prove there is. Such an evil is why there is such a thing as a good war. It is a war in which it is necessary for freedom of